By the time the Japanese launched their air attack force on the US Naval base of Pearl Harbour in Hawaii, raining down a hail of metal from the Pacific sky, the US had already been quietly preparing an Oceania invasion force, flooding troops into hastily prepared army bases in eastern Australia. With over 1 million American troops passing through the country, statistics might suggest that some would have been less desirable guests than others. The frightening reality that at least one would turn out to be a serial killer was a different matter entirely. A reality that certainly seemed to catch both the Americans and the Australians equally by surprise. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories Season 9, Episode 4. I'm your host Ben, as always. It's good to be back on the mic. I'm a little bit late this week. Interestingly, this episode is set in Australia, which I really enjoy doing because I feel like I don't get down to Australia too much with the episodes, and it's always like a part of the world that I love. And it's so you see, to be able to do episodes that are based in Australia, great fun. But it obviously comes with complications of not having quite as easy access to some sources that I might want. Basically, long story short, I've been waiting on just a confirmation of some details that I asked someone to check out for me, and it took a bit of time to get back. And I thought, I'd rather have confirmed those details to be right than release the podcast episode and then had to go back and either change it or just hope that, no one noticed. So yeah, it's a couple of days late. Sorry about that. But, going forward, everything's going to be on track because I decided to, my options were I could release it this weekend and then sort of set everything back by a week, or just release it a few days late and just continue on as normal. So I've chosen that option. So yeah, next episode's going to be as normal. Anyway, enough about all that. Hope you're well. This episode is, like I say, set down under, which is great. It's an area of the world that I really love. It's probably definitely a slightly more well-known story, but it interestingly correlates quite well with another episode that I did. I think it was season 7, maybe, of the blackout killer in London. But anyway, I'm sure we can talk about this at the end. For now, let's just get started. This episode is Eddie Leonski, the Brownout Strangler. With a population of just over 1 million, Melbourne, Australia, in the 1940s was, like most large cities of the time, a city of contrasts. The glass-domed roof of the Royal Arcade saw sunlight beam down onto stores advertising chocolate and candy, toys, decorated porcelain and fancy hats. On the streets outside, single-car, dark green trams rattled along the roads alongside cars and buses. The last cable-driven tram had been superseded by electric rails 2 years earlier, bringing the entire city network to the same modern standard. Glen Miller, neon cinema signs and palm tree-lined boulevards full of cafes and bars made up a significant part of life in the early 40s. But so too did the slums that had existed in the city since the mid-19th century. Described by the government's Housing Investigation Board as hotbeds of depravity and disease, where alcoholic adults lived amongst flea-ridden children in rodent-infested squats. The government had been working hard to improve these conditions, but several issues had slowed progress dramatically, not least the onset of war in 1939. Until now, the war had been a remote concept for Australians. Soldiers had been sent overseas since Australia officially joined Britain at war in September of 1939, but for those Australians still at home, the front lines were a long way off. That level of comfort slipped dramatically after the attack of Pearl Harbour in December of 1941, when all of a sudden the war came to Australia in a big way. The Japanese, who had been an important trade partner to Australia throughout the 1930s, were now the enemy on the doorstep. Propaganda leaflets were quick to follow, with the government warning that the soldiers were coming south. And when Singapore fell to the Imperial forces in February of 1942, the war was officially on the doorstep. Melbourne, with its deep water port and munitions factories, was considered a primary target, and soon air raid shelters sprung up throughout the city, erected by new volunteers of the Civil Defence Corps, as rumours circulated suggesting an evacuation programme might be on the way. An official brownout was declared, not quite as encompassing as a blackout, with stations and other large buildings dimming their light to 50% as 3 of every 4 streetlights were turned off. Those that were left on were painted so that their bulbs emitted a soft brown glow, heavily diminishing their usefulness, whilst trams, buses and cars all had their headlights covered with black, metal-slatted hoods and their interior lights turned off entirely. Speed limits were instigated in an effort to curb traffic accidents, which escalated rapidly thanks to the new dim conditions on their streets. All shops were to close by 6 p.m, and most were pushed to cover their windows overnight. At the same time, a heavy influx of American soldiers signalled the largest change and really brought home the feeling of war to the city. In truth, American soldiers had been drifting quietly into the country in relatively small numbers since the southward march of the Japanese in late 1941, with the occasional soft-top khaki army truck on the roads suggesting signs of the big change that sat just on the horizon. By the time of the official announcement that Australia would be the first stopping-off point for American troops to pour into the Pacific Theatre on the 19th of March 1942, around 10,000 troops were already busy creating the bases that would house more than 120,000 Americans by the end of the year. In Melbourne, the American troops were based in Camp Pearl, situated on a section of Royal Park in the central suburb of Parkville, where around 30,000 US troops had already moved into rows and rows of dark green tents that made up what was effectively a pop-up housing estate. This influx of Americans brought a buzz to the streets of Melbourne as young men with a regular income, an exchange rate in their favour, and plenty of time on their hands killed time drinking, dancing and otherwise enjoying life in the vibrant Australian city. Cafes, bars, cinemas and dance halls all did a roaring trade as US soldiers mingled with the Australian locals, who, for the most part, were excited to meet the Hollywood-tinged Americans. The influx didn't please everyone, and there were some tensions thanks to the escalating numbers of alcohol-related crimes that went hand in hand with the boost to the population, as well as the more moral objections that came from the church, who wanted bars to be closed on Sundays, a suggestion not shared by the otherwise bored military men. A compromise was eventually reached, with the bars allowed to remain open, as long as people only drank in keeping with the dignity of the day, which, to the shock of no one, was roundly ignored. One of the early American troops to have made his way to Australian soil, and one who was particularly enjoying the local hospitality, was a young man named Edward Joseph Leonski, a New Yorker who rather enjoyed a few drinks here and there. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Eddie Leonski should probably never have been a soldier at all. Edward Joseph Leonski was a very 20th century New Yorker. His father, John, had been born in Russia, whilst his mother, Amelia, had been born in Poland. Both parents had emigrated to America at the turn of the century and lived in New York, where they met, married, and then moved across the river to New Jersey in order to settle down and have a relatively large family. Their first child, a son named Vincent, was born in 1909, followed 2 years later by their second son, John Jr. 3 years after, a third son was born, Walter, followed by a daughter named Helen in 1916, and then, finally, Edward was born a year later. The baby of the family, he was always very close to his mother, who he had a deep affection for. It was an affection he didn't share with his father. Like so many migrants, John was a dock worker, loading and unloading ships in the huge port. Outside of his work, he was a deeply bitter man, and when he was home, he drank profusely, frequently becoming violent and beating and assaulting his wife and all of his children. This life finally became too much for Amelia, and in 1924 she separated from John, moving herself and all of her children back across the river to a small fifth-floor apartment on East 77th Street in New York. Never having been a particularly affluent family, they now fell to near poverty levels of destitution, as Amelia struggled to raise her family alone and more frequently turned to drink to numb her difficulties. She did eventually fall in with another man, but being another alcoholic, he didn't offer the family much in the way of security, and eventually Amelia suffered a complete breakdown in 1928 when she was hospitalised and diagnosed with schizophrenia and manic depression. To say that Eddie's upbringing had been tumultuous would have been something of an understatement, but the difficult environment never stopped him from being an energetic boy, keen on sports and hungry to perform. Day and night he practiced baseball and handball throughout his teenage years, and then he discovered weightlifting and bodybuilding, boxing and wrestling. They were all pastimes that lent themselves to his already impressive physical presence. Over 6 foot tall, with blonde hair and steel grey eyes, he was a good-looking young man who thrived in physical sports. Following his graduation from junior high school, he enrolled in a 3-year secretarial school at a vocational college in Brooklyn, where he excelled, finishing in the top 10 of over 300 students. Seemingly setting himself up for success, things stalled somewhat after he left the secretary school, and his job-seeking found him hopping through several positions at grocery and department stores until he finally seemed to settle down on the shop floor, where he charmed customers by lifting 40-kilogram bags of sugar just to show off. Somehow, he had managed to carve a reasonable existence in his day-to-day from the wreckage of his difficult home life, even though it did still seem to drag him back down at every opportunity. His brothers were far less interested in working hard and getting on, and were much keener on just thieving and robbing their way through. Eddie could never quite remove himself from his brother's influence, and at times he went along to help them break in and rob the local warehouses, until John was eventually put in prison for 2 years. As bad as this was, it did have one positive effect for Eddie, in that he could now start a romantic relationship with his older brother's girlfriend. Meanwhile, his sister, who was practically acting as the boy's surrogate mother, only found life more and more difficult, especially when Eddie's other brother, Walter, was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, an illness that would eventually see him institutionalised in 1940 for the rest of his life. All told, it was perhaps a blessing when the US Army came calling for Eddie in 1941, calling him up for compulsory military service and dragging him away from the bad influences of his life in New York. Eddie's first port of call was Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, where he joined the 52nd Signal Battalion and, thanks to his secretarial background, saw him drafted into battalion headquarters. Unfortunately, taking Eddie out of New York seemed to do little for his wayward swings. Compulsory military service had pulled him away from his difficult life, but it had also taken him away from the things that he loved, his mother, his sports and his job, leaving him with complicated feelings about the army. Promoted twice to private first class, he was demoted both times for misdemeanours, mostly to do with drinking. Truthfully, Eddie was not taken to military life well at all. He struggled to socialise, always keeping himself to himself, and as time went on, he seemed to actually shrink more and more, as he showed little to no interest in mixing with the other privates, and instead turned to drinking increasingly more heavily. Things came to a head when he was apprehended for assaulting a sex worker in the nearby red light district, but thanks to a failure to follow up on the case by the army, nothing more happened, and his life was allowed to continue as normal. Perhaps if it had, the army might have seen the assault as a warning sign that it likely was, because despite his drinking and the fairly serious assault, he was otherwise doing well in the eyes of his superiors, who felt he was friendly and hard-working enough. In fact, the only criticism that most could find in him was that he seemed to wash his hands more than was necessary, and that was hardly anything to be worried about as far as they were concerned. As Australia opened up their ports to the Americans and US troops began to flow towards the Pacific, Eddie finally found himself embarking on the great adventure of his life. Shipping up to San Francisco, he boarded an old luxury liner and set sail for Melbourne, where he would be one of the first American battalions to make Camp Pearl their home. Sailing on the 12th of January 1942, he arrived in Australia on the 1st of February after a fairly peaceful journey. Stepping off the boat for the first time in 2.5 weeks, he took in the sight of the palm trees, the trams, the cafes and bars, and began to think to himself that perhaps life in the army didn't have to be so bad after all. Perhaps he could even find something that he could enjoy in this land so far away from home. When Eddie Leonski arrived in Tent 16, Row 4 of Camp Pearl, he found the somewhat austere living situation he would be in for the foreseeable future. A large tent with beds for 4 people, it had a wooden floor with a wood burning stove in the centre. It was only a short walk to the showers and mess hall at least, thanks to Eddie being amongst the first soldiers in Australia. Perhaps by design, the army had bunked him with 3 other New Yorkers, Private Joseph Occhiogrossi, Private Vincent Tuzio, and Private Pat Farino. Despite their shared background, Eddie struggled to warm up to the men, choosing instead to keep himself to himself and focusing on the day-to-day of camp life. And it quickly turned out that camp life could be painfully slow. Soldiers were up early every morning for drills and then given the afternoons off. The American officials had been working hard to establish a solid entertainment infrastructure for the troops, with organised sports, movie shows and theatre productions. But in the early days of the camp, things were not quite in place, and it fell instead to the city of Melbourne to provide the men with enough to do to kill their time. And Eddie had more time to kill than most. Having been drafted into the kitchen, his daily duties started and finished with breakfast, meaning that for the vast majority of every day, he had nothing to do but occupy himself. Unsurprisingly for Eddie, this more often than not meant drinking. Just as his military life had been in America, so it continued in Australia. And soon after his arrival, he found himself being scouted for promotion. But Eddie liked his easy life in the kitchen, and when he was moved up to the position of clerk, he sabotaged the opportunity by getting drunk, passing out on his bed, and not showing up for duty. Within a week, he was back where he was happy, serving breakfast in the kitchen, and then kicking back for the rest of the day. Most of the time, he'd catch a tram on the edge of the camp into the centre of Melbourne, where he'd uncover a bar, hotel or cafe and mingle with Australians, drinking until midnight and showing off with his party trick of walking along the bar on his hands. Frequently, he didn't return to his bunk at midnight at all, instead choosing to go AWOL for days on end. This saw him eventually being arrested by the military police, who caught him drinking with a group of shady locals in one of the more dodgy bars of the city after being AWOL for multiple days, following a barroom brawl with some Australian soldiers. Agreeing to the punishment of 30 days in detention, he passed the time quietly, until one night he decided to get drunk, escape and head to the mess hall, where he bought himself some chocolate before heading back to the stockade under his own volition. As he had walked out, a member of the military police had fired a warning shot over his head, demanding him to stop, but he'd simply ignored it and continued on his way. Despite wanting to use the time in detention to clean himself up, as soon as he was released, Eddie went straight back to drinking heavily, until he was finding himself drunk more often than not, and showing up for work less and less. These weren't the only worrying signs that Eddie was showing either. One day, he was sparring with a boxing partner when he seemed to snap and began beating the other soldier relentlessly, only stopping after he had been dragged away from the ring by his fellow privates. By now, Eddie had been in Australia for 3 months, and he'd managed to find a few places he could drink way past closing time, where he could stay out as late as he liked and see where the night took him. On the night of Saturday, the 2nd of May, that was the Bleak House Hotel, just off the beach in Albert Park. It was a quiet little bar that Eddie had come to know served beer late, and with a tram station that could take him back to camp just outside. He'd been in town since about 10 a.m. that morning, drinking his way around his usual haunts. He'd met with some interesting locals and drank with a few fellow soldiers, but all in all, it had been a fairly uninspiring day. It was just before 2 a.m. when he bumped into an Australian woman named Ivy, as both of them were looking to shelter in an alcove until the next tram home. Ivy Violet McLeod was a 39-year-old Australian woman, working as a living carer for an elderly lady in an old house on Victoria Parade, just south of Royal Park. She had separated from her husband 5 years earlier in 1937 and had, for the past 5 months, been seeing an ex-military Australian man named John Thompson, who had recently returned to Melbourne following an honourable discharge. The two were planning to move away from the city, north up the coast to New South Wales, but in the meantime, John had been working in an aircraft factory. On Saturday, the 2nd of May, Ivy had spent most of the day visiting friends around Melbourne. At around 4:30 p.m, she caught a tram to Albert Park, where she met a friend for tea, before bouncing to several other friends, finally winding up visiting John at around 11 p.m. The couple drank a few beers together, and then eventually Ivy made to leave at around 1:30 a.m, aware that it would look improper if she was to stay overnight at John's house. Making her way to the tram stop, she walked through the cold night air, arriving 5 minutes later, just after 1:45 in the morning. Unfortunately, She'd left her journey just a shade too tight and had just missed the 1:45 tram. So, instead, she looked around for a taxi. Seeing nothing, she ducked into one of the alcoves separating the Bleak House Hotel from a row of shops and salons, only to discover that it was already occupied by a young man. After both parties overcame the shock of bumping into one another, they set to chatting whilst they waited for the next tram. Harold Gibson was a barman at the Bleak House Hotel, and he was up early on Sunday morning to work a little overtime cleaning up after the long Saturday night before. The morning was cold, and he lit a cigarette as he made the short walk from his home in an apartment block on Victoria Avenue, just over the road from the hotel. He pulled his cap low on his head and shuffled down the street in the direction of the hotel. As he approached, he noticed a man stooped over in the alcove next to the hotel who looked like an American soldier. Walking even closer, he saw the man stand up and quickly walk off down the street, east towards the beach. Realising that the man's presence was fairly unusual, the alcove was usually barricaded by a heavy iron gate, Harold stepped over into the dim light and peered inside. Too dark to see anything, he struck a match and looked deep into the glow of the orange light, where he saw a woman asleep on the ground. Putting out his foot, he nudged her leg, hoping to wake her up as gently as possible. When she didn't move, he leant over to shake her knee. As he moved closer, however, he could see quite clearly that the woman was dead. Reeling back out of the alcove, things suddenly lurched forward. He dashed over the road to the nearby phone box and made a call to the Victoria Police headquarters. And then, whilst he waited for the officials to arrive, he made his way over to the hotel to fetch a rug that he could hold up over the alcove to obscure the body from the eyes of the people in the street, who were, by now, beginning to emerge with the sunlight. Fortunately, Harold didn't have to wait alone in the alcove for too long, as a patrol car had been just around the corner when he called it in. Within minutes, police were on the scene, and shortly after, detectives were arriving with a doctor in tow. Within 30 minutes, the quiet morning street scene had turned from one of Sunday morning serenity to a bustling chaos, as detectives pottered around the scene, scribbling in notebooks and documenting everything they could see. The woman's handbag lay on the floor next to the body, and the glass on the lady's watch had broken on her wrist. When Dr. Green arrived, he set about making preliminary examinations of the body, noting that the woman's clothing had been pulled up around her waist, with the top half of her clothes ripped and bundled around her stomach. Blood had stained her nose, mouth and ears, and she had bruises on her eyes and neck. There was a large gash on her right temple, and she had taken such a blow on the back of her head that he was quite sure she had fractured her skull. At his best guess, he thought the woman had been dead for around 4 to 6 hours, placing her death between 2 and 4 a.m. that morning. Standing up and shuffling back into the light of the street, he concluded to the detectives that the woman had been murdered and the cause of death had been strangulation, though the blow to the back of the head could have also been fatal by itself. Meanwhile, detectives had been digging through the contents of the handbag that had been lying next to the body, and they were pretty sure the dead woman's name had been Ivy MacLeod, an identification which was later confirmed by her partner, John Thompson. With the case clearly a murder, the investigation was handed over to the Victoria Homicide Squad, and the reins of the case given over to a rough and ready old hand named Sid McGuffey. McGuffey had had a long career in law enforcement, dealing with everything from fraud and murder to organised crime and a gold robbery. He now sat in one of the most senior positions in the recently formed Homicide Squad, alongside another long-time law enforcement officer, Detective Inspector Harry Carey. McGuffey looked around and felt a strange feeling about the crime from the very outset. Why had the woman's clothes been ripped off and bundled around her waist if no sexual assault had seemingly taken place? Had the attacker just been scared away, or was there something even more unusual going on? To him, he felt like the scene had all been carefully orchestrated, with the woman's body having been purposefully arranged. And if he was right, then that suggested the Homicide Squad had an especially deranged killer on their hands. As he pondered these thoughts at the scene, he harboured a growing anxiety that the killer was almost definitely going to kill again, if they couldn't stop him first. Bearing all of this in mind, McGuffey began putting together a small team to assist him in the investigation, including a further 2 detectives, Fred Adam and George Murray, who spent the first few days trying to whittle down their initial suspects. Unfortunately, they didn't really have very much to go on, and that which they did wasn't much help. Their initial suspect had been the most obvious, Ivy's boyfriend, John Thompson. Realising that he would be a primary suspect, John had handed himself into the police station as soon as he had read about the murder in the paper, and following an interview, McGuffey was quite certain he had nothing to do with the murder at all. His information had helped them to sketch out the last few hours of Ivy's life, but everything he had said had fallen in line with the post-mortem examination. Unfortunately for McGuffey, this closed off their easiest route, and the only other suspect they had come about after they had interviewed Harold Gibson, who had told them that he had seen a tall, white American GI walking away from the scene shortly before he discovered the body. That was all good information, but that did mean that they were potentially looking for one man in 30,000. With a heavy sigh, McGuffey put out a note to the press, having them publish an appeal for information. At the same time, realising the size of the task ahead, he drafted in 2 more detectives to the case, Senior Detective Mal Boyd and Detective Bill Mooney. Meanwhile, over in the American Army headquarters, an unusual tip-off came in from an anonymous caller, though the receiver thought for sure that he sounded like an American. It was unusual for a few reasons. Firstly, because no police or detectives had mentioned anything about an American serviceman to any of the press so far, hoping to keep panic out of the public as best they could. And secondly, because of what the caller actually said. In what was described as an attempt to disguise his voice, the caller said, "About that dame who was murdered the other night, you should tell them to look for a man who walks on his hands." When the private asked for the caller's name, he said simply, "Never mind about that, buddy." The following Friday, 8th of May, Eddie Leonski was back in town, drinking and looking for something to do to kill time. Fortunately, he found just that when he spotted a young Australian woman sitting alone in the cafe that he'd wound up in. Fancying his luck, he sidled over to her table and introduced himself. The woman seemed receptive enough and told him her name was Coral. She'd been waiting for a dinner date with an American soldier named Jimmy Jones, but it seemed that he'd decided to stand her up. Sensing the evening didn't have to be a complete washout, the two put on their jackets and stepped outside into the rain and headed for the Astoria Hotel to grab a few drinks. 31-year-old Pauline Thompson was tall, with dark hair and large, bright eyes. A singer and musician, she had only been living in Melbourne for a short time, having recently moved with her daughter to the city ahead of her husband and son, who were back at home in the inland city of Bendigo, 90 miles to the north. Her husband was a police officer, and until he could fashion a transfer, the two were living separately, though he often visited on the weekends. Pauline had wanted to move to Melbourne in order to help kickstart a career in entertainment, but had so far been plugging away in multiple jobs, working as a typist and a switchboard operator for the local radio station. With the war arriving in Australia, Pauline was still hopeful that she could take advantage of the growing opportunities in theatre and the dance halls, and to that end, she changed her name to Coral and spent a considerable amount of time volunteering with amateur theatrical groups and juggling American soldiers, who she enjoyed entertaining whenever she had the night off from work. On Friday, the 8th of May, she'd spent the day meeting her husband and son, before she returned home to change into a black dress and hat for a night out with some women from work at a charity dance in the Music Lovers Club. First, though, she would be meeting a young, naive American soldier named Jimmy Jones for dinner, an appointment that her husband had not been especially keen on when she had told him about it earlier that day when she had met him for lunch to discuss plans for their son's upcoming 8th birthday before he had returned to Bendigo by train. Noticing the poor weather outside, she slipped on a black jacket, grabbed a handbag, and finished her outfit with a set of green glass and tortoiseshell beads. And then she stepped out into the rain, hoping to make it to the cafe on time. Given the weather, the trams were packed on the way, as people crammed into the dimly lit boxes and rattled through the unlit city. But still, Pauline managed to get to the cafe by 7 p.m. Frustratingly, she looked around and couldn't see Jimmy. She took a table and waited, and waited. By 7:15, she was just about to decide that Jimmy was a no-show and head home, when Eddie Leonski introduced himself. Happy to have some company, she welcomed him at a table. The two chatted for a while, and then they left for a nearby hotel that sold alcohol. The pair spent the rest of the night drinking gin and generally having a jolly good Friday night on the tiles. Coral, or Pauline, whatever her name was, sure could drink, Eddie noticed, and by 11:30pm, when they began making their way home, the two had managed to put away more gin than he could remember drinking in a long time. Pauline lived just a couple of blocks from the Astoria Hotel, but Eddie offered to walk her home all the same. The streets were dangerous these days, he told her. When they arrived, they shared a final cigarette under the veranda of the entrance to Morningside boarding house, where Pauline rented a room, and then Eddie turned to leave. Henry McGowan was walking his beat as a night watchman around Spring Street on the morning of Saturday, 9th of May. At 5am, he was thankful that the rain from the night before had eased up, but the morning had still been somewhat cold. As he moved his way along the empty streets, he came across a woman's handbag, tossed or forgotten by a Friday night reveller and discarded by the roadside. Bending down to pick it up, he saw its contents had been scattered across the street, so he collected up everything that he could see, put it back in the bag and dropped it off back in his office, where he figured he could hand it in once his shift had finished. Stepping back out into the street, he started back out on his circuit, for what he thought might be the last time before the sun came up. As he made his way back along Spring Street, he approached the veranda of the Morningside boarding house, when he spotted more discarded items. This time, it looked like somebody had thrown out a bundle of clothes onto the steps. Turning on his torch, he shone the low beam of light over to the entrance, and then stopped in his tracks. It wasn't a pile of clothing at all, but what he was quite sure was the body of a woman. Stepping backwards across the street, he quickly reached a nearby phone box and telephoned for the police, who arrived 5 minutes later in a patrol car, secured the scene, and made themselves comfortable whilst they waited for the detectives to arrive. McGuffey arrived an hour later, at around 6am, with his team in tow, along with Senior Detective Malboyd, who made an inspection of the scene. The woman's body was lying on its back, her black dress ripped and torn and ruffled up around her waist. A discarded book, newspaper and empty cigarette packet were on the ground, along with 2 cigarette butts and an empty pack of matches that had been tossed to one side. All around the body, small green and tortoiseshell glass beads lay scattered on the pavement. When the police doctor, Alan McCutcheon, arrived, he set about making an initial examination of the body, concluding to the detectives that she had been dead for around 4 to 6 hours, with the cause of death being almost certainly strangulation. The detectives opened their inquiries by going door to door in the boarding house to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual overnight, but nobody was of any help. Not even the couple renting the front room, whose open window had looked out onto the street, said they had heard a thing all night. When they learnt that the watchman who had discovered the body, McGowan, had also picked up a discarded handbag shortly before, he was sent back to his office to retrieve it for the detectives. Looking through the contents, they discovered a door key for a room in Morningside House, and when they showed it to the landlord, she confirmed that it had belonged to a young lady who had recently rented a room about a week earlier, named Coral Thompson, an ID that they confirmed after a brief deal of confusion where they found documents in her room naming her Pauline Thompson. By now it was 7:30am and the sun was rising. Before the streets could start to fill with their weekend traffic, the body of Pauline was removed to the morgue, whilst the detectives continued their questioning of the local residents, though by the time they left the site, they found themselves none the wiser at all. McGuffey's uneasy feeling had returned with a vengeance, however. Seeing the woman's body, strangled once more, just like the first murder, he was quite sure the two were linked, and that the murder was confirmation of his worst theories. The idea that there was a serial murder strolling through the streets of Melbourne was not one that he was especially interested in propagating to the press, though, and so officially he kept this to himself. Not that it stopped the press reaching similar conclusions for themselves. Half naked and strangled, Mrs. Pauline Coral Thompson, wife of a police constable at Bendigo, was found dead before dawn today on the steps of an apartment house on Spring Street, where she had been living since last weekend. In many respects, this crime resembles the mystery death of a 40-year-old Miss Ivy McLeod of East Melbourne, whose body was discovered in a shop doorway at Albert Park early last Sunday. What was worse for McGuffey was that he was sure that if the same man had now killed 2 women, he was fairly sure he wouldn't stop under his own steam. He would need to be captured and fast, but where would they even start? The only lead they still had was the man was possibly an American soldier, and this second murder had shone no new light on that whatsoever. Worse, the public had already been showing heavy disgruntlement towards the Brownout, with many perceiving them as dangerous. Now, with the murderer on the loose, the police had an added incentive to get a move on, preferably before people began pointing fingers at the American soldiers. In an effort that showed his desperation, McGuffey brought another 8 detectives onto the case to assist with the ever-growing investigation. Thanks to the discarded handbag, the detectives at least had a place to start. Poring through Pauline's notebook, they began contacting everyone they could and questioning them on the last time that they had seen her. With all the current information they had, every American soldier in the book stuck out like a sore thumb. Sadly, there were quite a few of them. Fortunately, Pauline's husband was able to furnish the police with the information that Pauline was planning to have dinner with an American army man on the night of her murder, and Pauline's landlady, too, mentioned that an American soldier had been hanging around the boarding house looking for Pauline all week. Just as the detectives began getting their hopes up, however, Jimmy Jones turned himself in to the local police station, aware that he was almost certainly a suspect in the case. He had planned to have dinner with Pauline on the night that she had been killed, he told the police, but due to the poor weather, he had run late. By 7:30 p.m, when he had arrived at the cafe they were supposed to have dinner at, he found Pauline had already left. Unsure if he'd ruined his chances with the woman that he had grown so fond of, Jimmy said that he had returned to his camp and been in bed by 10 p.m. The detectives checked out his story and found straight away that his alibi fit perfectly. Confident that they could rule Jimmy off their list, they were now back at square one. For McGuffey, it became abundantly clear that he would have to try and piece together what Pauline was doing after she had left the cafe, between 7:30 and 11 p.m, in the hours before she died. Recognising the poor weather on the night, he took a stab in the dark, that no one would have travelled too far if they could help it. Laying out a map of Melbourne, he divided up the streets directly around the cafe and set about searching for a barman, landlord or restaurateur who might have seen Pauline in their establishment. A composite photo was put together using a tailor's dummy wearing similar clothing to Pauline's, with one of her professional headshots superimposed over the top. Then the detectives fanned out, hopping from bar to cafe to hotel, flashing the photo around and questioning everyone they could. In what was the first spot of luck for the investigation, this was a process that bore almost immediate results, when a barman at the Astoria Hotel recognised Pauline straight away. Sure, he said, she'd been drinking all night in the bar of the hotel with an American soldier. Unfortunately, that was all the information he could give. This information did throw up a new concern for McGuffey. Always aware that an American soldier may have been involved since the very first witness said that he had seen a GI running from the scene, he now realised that he would have to approach the American consul and broach the delicate matter that their number one suspect was one of their own. Fortunately, the Americans were keen to cooperate with the investigation fully, opening up their books to the detectives in order for them to begin tracing individuals' movements in and out of the camp. Unfortunately, they were not the best kept records, but they were a start at least. McGuffey also took the bold move of leaking this information to the press, along with a composite photo of Pauline, in order to see if they could reel in any new witnesses to the couple's movements that Friday night. The news that the suspect appeared to be an American soldier had two effects on the Melbourne population. Firstly, the detectives were inundated with tip-offs, so that by midweek they were able to piece together a pretty good picture of what Pauline and the mystery man had been up to on Friday night, drinking together and generally having a good time. Unfortunately, the man was still just that, a complete mystery. Secondly, the streets of Melbourne began to grow emptier by the day, as rumours began circulating that the city was in the grip of its own Jack the Ripper, stalking women through the dim streets. Many women stopped going to work entirely in order to avoid walking home in the Brownout, whilst those that had no choice were rarely seen walking alone. Not helping matters on this front was the press, who now, having picked the story up nationally, began referring to the murderer as the Brownout Strangler. Outside of these two direct changes, there was one more general feeling that changed within the city, the feeling of positivity that had buzzed around the influx of American soldiers, which now flipped dramatically to one of suspicion and fear. The arrival of the Americans had seen a party atmosphere erupt across Melbourne, but now, for many, the party felt very much over. Back in Camp Pearl, the party for Eddie Leonski had never really seemed to start. In recent days, he had been drinking heavily, even more so than usual, and his cold, standoffish demeanour had only grown as he seemed to shrink more into himself than ever before. His only friend at the camp, a young, naive soldier named Joey Gallo, had seen Eddie spiralling into his drunken despair and grown increasingly concerned. Not that Eddie cared. As far as he felt, Joey Gallo was not even a real friend anyway. Eddie had stood up for Joey back in America when he had been bullied during training, and now the guy had attached himself to him in a way that Eddie didn't really care for. Still, Eddie did at least find him someone that he could talk to, and he needed to talk. On the night of Saturday the 16th of May, Eddie had decided to head into town, and Joey thought it was probably best to tag along, worried that Eddie might wind up getting himself into more trouble with their superiors. As they boarded a tram towards Eddie's favourite haunts, he decided to open up to Joey, telling him that he was pretty sure that he had killed a woman. Unsure of what to make of this revelation, Joey kept up with Eddie, stunned as they made their way to St Paul's cafeteria, barging their way through the busy Saturday night crowds. Joey got them a table and sat down opposite Eddie and waited to see if he would elucidate further on this bizarre story, pulling out a paper and fingering the story of Pauline's death, which the two sat reading in silence. When they were finished, Eddie said that he was pretty sure that that was the woman that he'd killed, though the specifics were lost on him. Apparently, he just couldn't seem to recall any of the details, not even the description of the steps leading up to her boarding house. He did, however, still have a pack of her cigarette and a small amount of cash that he'd taken from her handbag before he had tossed it aside on his way back to camp. Joey looked at the souvenirs, gobsmacked, whilst Eddie told him that he'd only wished that he'd managed to take something more personal from his victims, if only to prove that he'd been the killer. He also began talking about another murder, one a week or so before Pauline's. To Joey, the whole thing sounded insane, and when he asked Eddie why he'd done it, he got only a blank stare back, a shrug of the shoulders, and the simple reply, "I don't know." When Eddie decided to head back to camp, Joey let out a huge sigh of relief. He then spent a difficult night in bed, alone, going over everything that he had heard that night, unsure of what to believe. He knew the right thing to do was to turn Eddie in, but how could he know any of it was even true at all? Perhaps he'd just rather not know. Eddie had been kind to him before, after all. He'd helped him out. Perhaps it really was just all a strange prank that Eddie was playing. 3 days later, and Eddie was back drinking in the city, this time in Parkville Hotel. He'd met an Australian man named Rupert Burns, and the two had had a few drinks and decided to head back to Rupert's place, grab some food, and then head out to catch a movie at the cinema. Rupert was staying in a boarding house, only a brief walk from the hotel, and when they arrived, he left Eddie in his room whilst he went to the kitchen to get something for them to eat. When he came back, Eddie was nowhere to be found. It was about 9 p.m. when Eddie rolled into the latrines back in Camp Pearl, covered in yellow, sticky mud. Private Marcel Jasinski had been washing up before heading to bed, and when he noticed Eddie come in, he looked at him in some surprise, before advising him to try and wash the mud off himself before it dried and turned to hard clay. Eddie seemed a bit dazed, and after staring at Jasinski for a moment, he turned and left without saying a word. Jasinski just shrugged and finished up in the latrines before heading off to bed and thinking nothing more of the fairly strange meeting. It was 7 a.m. the next morning, on Tuesday the 19th of May, when a Melbourne butcher named Albert Whiteway was rattling past Camp Pearl in his horse-drawn delivery cart, doing his rounds, delivering meat around the city, when he spotted a woman's hat lying next to an umbrella on a grass verge by the side of the road. Thinking it strange, he rattled by for a few more feet, until he noticed more items scattered about carelessly across the road. Looking over past the verge, he saw the fence of Royal Park. And there, 10 metres beyond, perched on a verge dug from a trench in the ground in front, lay the unmistakably grim sight of a dead body, covered in mud. Looking around, he spotted an Australian soldier, Don McLeod, walking up the street and called out, signalling for him to come over. The soldier approached the butcher, and the two men clambered over the fence to find the body of a young woman, face down in the mud, her clothes ripped and torn and bundled up around her waist. McLeod hailed a second soldier and had him stand guard at the scene, whilst he himself ran off in the direction of the Royal Park police station to get some help. At the same time, Albert scribbled down his contact information for the guardian soldier to hand over to the police, and then hopped back on his cart to continue on his deliveries. The sun had already risen when McGuffey arrived at the Camp Hale Trench just after 8 a.m. Having already collected the hat, umbrella, gloves, handbag, purse, and a woman's magazine from the street outside, he set about cataloguing the scene inside the camp. The body was lying on what appeared to be the spoil dug directly from a trench just before it, consisting almost entirely of a mustard yellow clay. Drag marks smeared through the mud all the way from the fence right up to the body that itself was covered head to toe in mud. The woman's neck appeared to have some bruising, and small bloodstains were all around the nose and mouth. There was little else to be determined on site, however, as the camp was beginning to come alive, and crowds were starting to gather. Signalling for the body to be removed to the morgue, McGuffey then attempted to call in the aid of an Indigenous tracker, who he hoped might be able to conjure up a story from the sticky mud that had surrounded the body. Unfortunately, too many people had already stomped around the scene, and no solid information was able to be uncovered, only that the tracker thought that perhaps there were footprints leading off back towards the American Army camp. Back in the morgue, Dr. Crawford carried out a more in-depth examination of the woman's body, cleaning her of the mud that had covered her skin, uncovering clear signs that the woman had died from strangulation. A more grim discovery was the wedge of mud that had quite clearly been used to fill her vagina. Back with the detectives, McGuffey was filtering through the handbag that had been found on the road just outside of the camp, where he was able to determine the identification of the victim. Gladys Lillian Hosking was a well-educated, well-travelled Australian woman, 40 years old, who had grown up in Perth. Short, with cropped dark hair, she had worked as a dental nurse, a bursar in a private girls' school, and even had a few run-outs as a stage actor before she had decided to take a few years off to travel around Europe. Upon her return to Australia, she had taken a position in the University of Melbourne as the Secretary and General Assistant to the head of the Chemistry Department, where she was also involved in the University Theatre Group as well as the Red Cross, where she helped produce charity plays. On the evening of Monday the 18th of May, she had been working late in preparation for upcoming exams. Troubled by the late hour and the dark streets outside, she had not been looking forward to her trip home, thanks to the stories in the papers of the Brownout Strangler, especially as she lived in a boarding house that sat almost opposite Camp Hale. Still, her walk home was not a long one, and she found some relief in the vigilante patrols that had recently taken to the streets. When she finally left work, she bid farewell to her colleague, Dorothy Pettigrew, and made her way across campus alone, cowering beneath her umbrella in an attempt to keep herself dry from the falling rain. That was when she heard the voice of an American calling out from her from behind. Stopping, the two chatted for a while and then started off towards the direction of Camp Hale. Another American soldier, Francis Hanson, walked past them a little while later. He thought the two were talking well enough, the woman picking up the slack, and he paid the two little mind. It was a little after 8 p.m. when Private Malcolm Walsh, a member of the military police on guard of a group of army trucks outside Camp Hale, saw Gladys with an American soldier disappear around the side of the trucks under a shared black umbrella. When he handed over duty to an Australian soldier later that night, he decided it might be best to mention the couple that he had seen earlier, though he doubted it was any real concern. As far as he thought, what two adults got up to at night was between themselves. A little while later, however, the Australian guard heard a noise coming from the same trucks, so walking over to see what he could see, he shone his flashlight around the parked vehicles. When the beam landed squarely on the shocked face of an American soldier, covered in mud, he called out, asking where he'd been. The soldier replied, asking how he could catch a tram to Royal Park. The Australian found the whole scene quite amusing. Clearly the American had been drinking. He'd managed to fall over in the mud, and now he didn't even seem to know where he was. "Turn around," he told the American. "It's right over the fence there, behind you." Both reports from Walsh and the Australian guard were uncovered the day following the murder of Gladys by detectives who had been scouring Camp Hale. The Australian authorities had once again contacted the American officials and been promised complete cooperation in any investigation into their soldiers. Their first action was to place the entire camp on lockdown, whilst the detectives could split up into teams and ask around, hoping they could land on something sufficiently suspicious, whilst others dug through camp records. Quite sure that the two guards had seen Gladys and her killer, both were questioned, but neither were able to furnish the police with much of a description, beyond the soldier's uniform being covered in mud. With the reveal of a third murder in the press, the atmosphere in Melbourne turned incredibly sour, especially for the American soldiers, who now found the majority of goodwill from the locals entirely dried up. Official statements were still not connecting the murders, but the press were convinced and doing their best to imprint the name of the Brownout Strangler onto the minds of the city's population. Melbourne police hunt Brownout Strangler. There are so many points of similarity between the 3 recent killings of Melbourne women that the police are now more inclined to believe that the murders are the work of the same sex maniac. Little did the public nor the press know that McGuffey and his team of detectives were slowly circling around a suspect who had nowhere to hide. Following the 3rd murder, the streets around Melbourne were becoming increasingly quiet during the brownouts, but McGuffey was feeling more confident than ever that the investigation into the recent murders was finally getting a break. Touring through the camp over the previous few days had uncovered a good deal of witnesses who felt they might be able to identify a suspect should they see him again. They had also finally uncovered the anonymous tip-off phoned into the American military police, telling them to look out for a man who walks on his hands. This would have seemed cryptic at the time of the call, but now McGuffey was hearing all sorts of stories about a US serviceman known in town as Eddie, who liked to drink and show off doing exactly that. There were also new reports coming in from a couple of failed attacks on women that sounded a lot like the killer as well. On Tuesday the 12th of May, a woman named Kathleen Elliott was attacked on her way home from work on the eastern boundary of Camp Pearl. As she made her way home, an American serviceman walked up behind her and asked her if he could walk with her. Seeing no reason to refuse, the pair walked along, chatting for a while, but when she went to let herself into her front door, he had jumped in front of her, grabbed her by the throat, and attempted to strangle her. Kathleen kicked, screamed, and struggled just enough to wriggle free from the soldier's grasp, who then ran away into the night. A second attack came shortly after on the same night, very similar to the first, with the victim struggling free from the soldier's grasp around her throat. 2 days later, on Thursday the 14th of May, an American soldier had tried to jump a 3rd woman as she had tried to let herself into her front door. As he tried to grab her, she screamed, alerting her uncle to the hallway, who burst out onto the front room and chased the soldier away. Even more interesting for McGuffey was the fact that the uncle was now pretty sure that he could pick the attacker out in a lineup, which is exactly what the detectives were currently arranging. Frustratingly, however, the camp arranged 2 lineups, filtering battalion by battalion through the mess hall, and neither led to any solid identification of a suspect. Meanwhile, with the lockdowns and increased police presence around the camp, both military and civilian, Joey Gallo's concerns about his buddy Eddie and his own moral conscience were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. He had recently asked Eddie about the killings again, and this time Eddie had told him that none of what he had said was true, but Joey was not so sure. Finally, on the morning of Wednesday the 20th of May, he pulled up the courage to approach his regimental officer and recite the story that he had been turning over and over in his mind for days. Quickly ushered towards the military police, he sat down and gave a formal statement, detailing everything that Eddie Leonski had told him about his killing of the 2 strangled victims. At the same time as Joey Gallo was signing off on his statement, McGuffey was busy arranging a 3rd lineup. This time with the victim of the 3rd unsuccessful attack alongside her uncle. McGuffey had had a lot of hope for this lineup in particular, and so his hopes were crushed even more severely when it once again failed to turn up any identification. A shocking coincidence gave him reason to be hopeful, however, when the girl and her uncle were waiting to be escorted home by the military police when a group of American soldiers casually walked past chatting. The uncle stood aghast and fingered one of them, a tall blonde soldier, as the man who had attacked his niece. After they confirmed what they were hearing, the military police quietly approached the soldier and declared their intent to arrest him. Edward Leonski said nothing, allowing himself to be escorted to the stockade with no fuss, drama, or aggression at all. As he sat on the bed, his wrists handcuffed to the frame, he only felt relief. With Eddie Leonski in detention, McGuffey was busy picking over his belongings in his Camp Pearl tent. Under Eddie's bed, the detectives found a tin box full of newspaper cuttings, all related to the 3 murders. They also found a few items of clothing, his field pants and underwear that appeared to have stains that looked suspiciously like blood. Yellow clay, looking a lot like the clay that made up the spoil dug from the trench where the body was found, was also found in the tread and the lace eyelets from his boots. Everything was collected and sent off to the Police Scientific Bureau for analysis, whilst Eddie himself was left to stew alone for a full day. The following morning, McGuffey started his interview, kicking things off with a soft approach, asking about Eddie's life in America and of how he liked the military. He found the man to be fairly jovial given the circumstances. He seemed to be proud of his drinking ability, of his physical prowess, and of his ability to pick up women. Somewhat more unusual for a man of his age, McGuffey felt that Eddie had an unusually strong attachment to his mother. When he mentioned Joey Gallo's statement, Eddie dismissed the whole story, saying that he'd been tagging him along in a prank. This, he said, was also why he'd been collecting the newspaper cuttings, in order to bolster his story. A short break was called to allow Eddie to undergo a medical exam before questioning began again in the afternoon, where McGuffey decided to change tact. Asking Eddie where the mud on his uniform and boots had come from, Eddie replied that it had come from the ground around the kitchen. McGuffey took him on a walk around the camp and asked him to show exactly where. With his handcuffs removed, security came from the military police who followed them, with instructions to shoot Eddie if he tried to run. No matter where they walked through the camp, though, none of the mud had the distinctive yellow colour found only where the body had been found. Whilst walking, Eddie told McGuffey that he'd been out drinking on the nights of all the murders, but not with any women. He also denied knowing anything or having seen anything to do with the 3 murder sites when McGuffey extended their walk and took him to see the crime scenes. That night, as McGuffey left Camp Pearl, he was convinced that Eddie Leonski was their man, no matter how much he denied everything. As far as the press were concerned, though, McGuffey felt it best to keep things open, saying that they were following multiple lines of inquiry and had nothing concrete yet. The next day, the detectives organised 2 more lineups. The first was with the soldier who passed Gladys on the street on the night of her murder. He looked at the men lined up in front of him, but wasn't able to confidently say he could identify any single one of them as the man that he had seen. The second lineup was more troublesome for Eddie, when he was trotted out in front of the guard who investigated the noise behind the trucks on the night of Gladys's murder and had shone a flashlight on the soldier, speaking to him, telling him he was right in front of Royal Park. This time, the Australian soldier was able to confirm with absolute certainty that the man had been Eddie. Whether or not Eddie realised the likelihood that the soldier would recognise him, that afternoon he decided to change his story and confess to killing Gladys Hosking. McGuffey took a short coffee break, and following that, Eddie also admitted to killing Pauline Thompson too. When McGuffey asked him if he'd killed Ivy too, he said that he could only remember choking someone by the beach, but no other details. The confessions were great news for the detectives, but they presented an interesting problem. Thanks to the Defence Visiting Forces Act of 1939, any American soldiers arrested in Australia were to be handed over to American officials to be tried under American law. Further, Gladys had technically been murdered on American soil. Fortunately, once again, everyone was keen to cooperate, and so Eddie was moved to a civilian prison to await trial under US military law, whilst McGuffey and his crew of detectives maintained equal access to question him alongside the military police. The next morning, after less than half a day in a real prison cell, Eddie confessed fully to killing all 3 women. Pauline had been the hardest to kill, he said, as she was able to drink so much. With the confessions signed and confirmed, it fell next to organising his court-martial trial, which was scheduled to be held on the morning of Monday the 8th of June. To pass the time in his cell, Eddie took to reading and drawing pictures of naked women. When he met with his defence team, everyone immediately realised that the only possible defence they would be able to muster that might have any legitimacy at all was a plea of insanity. The whole thing didn't seem to concern Eddie too much, though, and several times he had to be warned against making dark jokes about killing women. By the time that June rolled around, Eddie was still as jovial as ever. His trial kicked off with 2 days of preparations before beginning in earnest at 10 a.m. on the morning of Wednesday the 10th of June. The proceedings didn't get especially far, as after Eddie pleaded not guilty, much to the dismay of everyone involved, his defence team applied for an adjournment whilst they could carry out proper medical examinations to determine the state of his mental health. The application was granted, and medical examinations were prepared for Eddie with a trio of psychiatrists to take place over a period of several weeks. Throughout the exams, Eddie told the doctors that he felt like he had dreamed the murders, saying that he'd never attacked the women to sexually assault them, nor had he done it for any financial gain. He simply had no idea why he had done it at all. His only defence seemed to be that alcohol made him do strange things. He also told them that he wished that he'd been caught after the first murder, saving everyone a lot of time and grief. In their conclusions, the doctors said that they discovered Eddie had an unhealthy attraction to women's voices, and on several occasions he had mentioned wanting to capture them. All of his emotional relationships throughout his life appeared to have been stunted, and his current predicament had not seemed to get him down at all of which they felt were unnatural positions. All three doctors agreed that though they would not clarify him as insane, he almost certainly showed signs of psychopathic personality, as well as being egotistical and psychologically damaged from his family life. The trial re-adjourned on Monday the 13th of July, with the medical evidence obtained from the three doctors given straight away in order for the court to decide whether or not Eddie was fit to stand trial. Ruling that he was, things finally began in earnest. Over the following days, a long string of 46 witnesses were called for the prosecution, including geologists from the University of Melbourne who had examined the clay found on Eddie's clothing and determined that it had been dug from an ancient fossil layer which only existed in a single trench in Camp Pearl, and possibly in only one place in all of Melbourne, which just happened to be precisely where the body of Gladys had been found. Joey Gallo was called to give his own testimony on the stories that Eddie had told him about killing the women. His story showed Eddie to be manipulative at best and callously murderous at worst. The defence did attempt to undermine his statements during cross-examination, suggesting that he was not quite as friendly with Eddie as he had perhaps thought. They also pointed out that what Eddie had said about the newspaper cuttings had been true. At no point had he told Joey anything that he could not have read in the press. When the psychiatrists were asked to give their own evidence, the first, Dr. Harper, said that he had had a psychopathic personality that had been greatly exacerbated by the amount of alcohol that he had been drinking since joining the armed forces. Whilst he stopped short of identifying him as insane, he did tell the court that Eddie had a maladjustment that kept him from falling in the group of normal individuals or mentally well people. All three doctors said they believed he would kill again given the opportunity. This was all pretty damning stuff, and when they finished, the prosecution stood aside to allow the defence their own show. Unfortunately for Eddie, it was nowhere near as robust. Calling 11 witnesses, they focused mainly on the idea that Eddie was mentally unsound. His confessions, they said, were flawed since they were given by a man who had been in a bad psychological place. Without the confessions, they argued, the prosecution had very little case against Eddie at all. Prior to joining the army, they continued, Eddie had been a good, hard-working man, and so they worked to pin the responsibility on the army itself, who they said had turned him to drink and done nothing to help him, and thus had created the man he was today. If they had been honest, even the defence themselves would have admitted that, whilst they may have had a moral point, their argument in a legal trial was especially weak. During their closing arguments, the prosecution hit back, saying that alcohol was not an excuse for murder. When the members of the court-martial were asked to vote on their verdict, the results were gathered in less than 35 minutes. Private Leonski, it is my duty as president of this court to inform you that the court, in closed session and upon secret written ballot, 3/4 of the members present at the time the vote was taken concurring in each finding of guilty, finds you, of all specifications and of the charge, guilty. And again in closed session and upon secret written ballot, all of the members present at the time the vote was taken concurring, sentences you to be hanged by the neck until dead. Silence rang through the courtroom. When the reporters looked towards Eddie for a reaction, he looked over to them and said simply, "Well, I guess that's that." Following his trial, Eddie managed to maintain his ever upbeat demeanour, despite staring execution in the face. When he was taken back to his cell immediately after the sentencing, he told one of the police on duty that he felt he should probably quit smoking, and then, with a wry smile, said it was bad for his throat. Very little opposition came from the sentence, and strangely, it was the Australian public who disagreed the most with the sentence of hanging, due to the feeling towards executions generally. Disagreement was never particularly strong, however, and soon Eddie's execution was scheduled to take place in the execution chamber at Pentridge Prison under strict secrecy. A hangman was brought in anonymously from South Australia to do the task, who brought his own 2-inch thick nylon rope along for the task. On 5:30 a.m. on the morning of Monday the 9th of November 1942, Edward Leonski was taken from his cell and led to the gallows. When asked if he had any final words, he just shook his head. A black cloth was slung over his head, and then the hangman had tripped the ground beneath his feet with a pull of a lever. Eddie's body hanged for 2 minutes before being pulled down, handed over to a pair of doctors who administered a lethal injection just to be sure. No details of the execution were ever entered into the prison's records. His body was interred in Springfield Cemetery on the outskirts of Melbourne. Leonski was hanged at Pentridge Jail, Melbourne, half an hour before he was taken from the Melbourne City Watchhouse cell in which he had been detained in close confinement for 24 weeks under an armed guard of USA soldiers. His execution closed a murder case unparalleled in Australian criminal history, and probably unique in British criminal records. Unique because as a citizen of another country, he was tried in British territory by a military tribunal of his own country for a civil offence in this country. It was only yesterday that he was told that he would be executed. President Roosevelt's warrant was read to him today, and 2 priests later visited him in his cell. Leonski exercised alone in the remand yard of the Melbourne City Watchhouse and conversed animatedly with the guards. He remained undisturbed about his fate throughout. A month later, Leonski's body was dug up and moved to an area specially designated for American servicemen. At the end of the war, it was removed once more, this time to a specially built area in Manson's Park Cemetery in Queensland, where all American servicemen were buried in one place. 2 years later, it was dug up again and made its final journey to Honolulu in Hawaii, where it was once more buried, this time to be forgotten forever. His mother was never made aware of his crimes or his death. As for poor Joey Gallo, who had had the displeasure of calling Eddie a friend for a while, he received an honourable discharge in July of 1945 after being awarded the American Defence Service Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Service Medal, and the Good Conduct Medal. He returned to America, got a job as a clerk, and died in New York in 2004, aged 89 years old. Hopefully, with the knowledge that his good conscience had seen him do the right thing, even under incredibly difficult circumstances. So that was the story of the Brownout Strangler. And I guess it's been a long one, so we won't talk too much, but there's definitely some things that we can sort of chat about after this short advert breaks. Welcome back. So, yeah, there's a couple of things there. I mean, it's a long story and it's an interesting story, and it's interesting how it correlates so much with the blackout killings of, was it George Cummins or something, his name? I did the episode, I think, a couple of seasons ago. But yeah, it's interesting how it correlates with that. I think what else was interesting was, despite that the London Strangler being in a lot of the press at the time in Australia, no one seemed to make any connection to the two at all, even though they were keen to sort of talk about the Brownout Strangler as a new Jack the Ripper. They never sort of made any connection there. I thought that was, an interesting thing. Anyway, that's just a sort of small aside. I guess that one of the main sort of mysteries and things that intrigues me with this is who made the initial tip-off to the military police about Leonski being a murderer. Well, they didn't say directly. They said, was it keep an eye out or be aware of a man who walks on his hands, which, is interesting in itself because it's such a cryptic tip-off, but it makes you wonder who called that in. Was someone aware that Leonski had killed a woman and that he was, at large? Or was it Leonski himself? Because everything suggests that he regretted doing what he'd done. Not in a, he didn't seem to regret it at all in a, like, I regret killing people way. It was almost like a detached regret, like, oh, I regret having wasted so much time and been a burden to people, you know, like that sort of detached regret that he had. And he mentioned on a couple of occasions during his statements to police and things that he wished he'd been caught earlier so that he wouldn't have done more murders or more killings. You know, and the other thing as well is he spoke to Joey Gallo and he told him, you know, oh, I killed those women. It's almost like he wanted Joey Gallo to turn him in. You know, I got the impression that he wanted to be caught. Whether he wanted to be caught or whether he just got a thrill from escaping justice, you know, by the skin of his teeth sort of thing, I don't know. You know, maybe it was that. But it's... but that's a really interesting thing that you rarely see sort of commenting on, like, who made that initial tip-off? I think it was him. I almost, you know, I definitely think it was him. The guy that called was was described as having an American accent, or the military policeman that took the call said that he thought that he had an American accent, but that the caller was trying to disguise their voice in some way. But that just makes me sort of more suspicious of Eddie and think that he did it himself. So I fairly think that he tried to basically grass himself up and turn himself in a very cryptic way, which in many respects makes sense for these kind of killers, right? You know, they never just turn themselves in outright, do they? They always do some cryptic, like, breadcrumb trail for the police, and I just feel like it fits. So to me, I don't really have any strong evidence other than vibes, I guess. But I think that's, you know, I'm almost sure that that's who called in. Yeah. Otherwise, I don't know how much there is to really talk about it in terms of like mysteries or, you know, sort of make up our own theories here. But I think one thing that is sort of worth talking about is the defence in the court-martial trial. Now, they had this like idea that, you know, the responsibility for Eddie should be on the army, right? And I don't think they were ever going to, that was never going to work in a court of law, I don't think. But they did make an interesting point, I think. And, you know, I'm not in any way suggesting that Eddie was, you know, an innocent party in this, or that he should be, you know, felt sorry for anything. He's clearly psychopathic, like the people say. He clearly had some sort of detachment, and he was clearly a violent, brutal man. And, you know, his murders are some of the scariest types for me because of his detachment. But it is an interesting question, you know, what was going on in the military at the time? Like they got all these men that they were like bringing in through the draft, and they must have, you know, surely someone must have noticed that he was drinking really heavily and was what sounds like falling apart at the seams. You know, did they just at the time, like because obviously it was in the 40s, you know, at the time, did they just not see that? Did they just sort of consider like, oh, you know, you need to man up and get on with it, you know, stop being a mama's boy or something like that? Like, you know, or was it the fact that they just completely missed it, you know, missed the fact that he was clearly drinking heavily and falling apart? I don't know. You know, I'm not suggesting in any way that they bear any responsibility for the crimes. But I do think it's an interesting point, you know, there that the army, yeah, and I think it's something, I don't know much about the military, but I do think it's something that these days is much better understood and much better taken care of. You know, people's sort of mental health around the army and military service is taken much more care of these days. Because, and I think why this is an interesting point is because when you have a draft like that, you know, I'm sure they're going to take quite a lot of people who are just not going to get on in the military, right? Like, if you join the military, you want to be in the military, like that's your dream, or you know, that's what you want in life. Like, even then you might not fit in, but there's a high chance that you're going to get on just fine. But when you're drafted in, there's quite a high chance that you're just, you know, you might have like anxieties or, you know, concerns or just, it might not be for you. You know, any job is not for everyone, right? And in the military, especially so, you know, being the sort of specialist job it is, it's not a one size fits all sort of career. So I can imagine, you know, quite a lot of those draftees in the 40s really suffered, you know, psychologically and mentally because they didn't want to be there, but they had no other choice. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. And obviously it manifests in a very grim way with this story. You know, turning Eddie into. I mean, I think he always had the ability to do what he did, or the opportunity was going to arise at some point to do what he did, but it just seemed like the military life and led him to drinking heavily, which then sort of exacerbated his issues and sort of handed him the opportunity to do what he did. But yeah, I think I just thought it was an interesting point really when I was reading it. It's less, you'd say, it's not really any sort of like theorizing, so I'll just leave it there. But yeah, I thought it was interesting nonetheless. But yeah, if you would like to let me know your thoughts on this episode or any episode, you can do so. contact@darkhistories.com is the email, and then all social media, all those links are in the show notes. There's also a link there to the website and to ways that you can support the show. There are ad-free episodes if commercial episode if commercial messages aren't to your taste. Big shock. Of course, they're not. I don't think anyone enjoys them really. They're a necessary evil, unfortunately. If you'd like episodes without them, I have a Patreon and things like that. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. As always, it's always a pleasure to sit here and record these episodes. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, obviously next episode, like I said at the start, going to be a little bit quicker, a week and a half from now, something like that. So yeah, until then, take care, sleep tight.